Come on, lady. One move. Show us what you've got.
What are you looking at?
This mat is for champions, not for the cleaning crew. Pick up your mop and get lost.
To Jason Miller, she was just a woman who cleaned floors. Someone who didn't belong on the mat. Someone easy to humiliate. But a few seconds later, the laughter stopped. With one effortless move, the janitor sent America's rising star crashing to the floor in front of coaches, teammates, and dozens of cameras. Then the truth came out. The woman he mocked wasn't just a janitor. What followed was a viral scandal, a desperate act of revenge, and a lesson Jason would never forget. Because the strongest person in the room is often the one nobody sees coming. Colorado Springs woke beneath a pale gray sky, with cold mountain winds sweeping down from the Rockies and rattling the windows of the National Wrestling Training Center. The morning air carried a sharp chill despite the season, and inside the massive facility, the sound of athletes training echoed through the halls long before sunrise. Jason Miller was already the center of attention. At 24 years old, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with a powerful athletic build shaped by years of elite competition. His short blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clean-shaven jawline sharp and camera-friendly, and his bright blue eyes carried the confidence of someone who had spent years being told he was destined for greatness. Jason had become America's fastest rising wrestling star, the athlete many believed would lead the national team to international glory. Success had come quickly, and with it came a growing arrogance that many coaches quietly worried about. That morning, dozens of wrestlers were finishing warm-ups as Jason completed another dominant training session. Several younger athletes gathered around him, laughing at his jokes and listening to his stories about sponsors, interviews, and upcoming competitions. Standing nearby was Coach Mark Reynolds, a 58-year-old former Olympic wrestler with broad shoulders, graying hair, and deep lines around his eyes earned through decades of discipline. Mark was respected throughout the wrestling community for his calm leadership and ability to develop champions. While he admired Jason's talent, he had begun noticing troubling changes in the young athlete's attitude. Across the room, another figure moved almost unnoticed. Denise Carter slowly pushed a mop across the edge of the wrestling mats. At first glance, she appeared to be an ordinary maintenance worker in her late 50s. She stood about 5'7", with dark brown skin, short curly black hair streaked with silver, and a lean frame that suggested years of physical work. Her plain gray uniform blended into the background, and she rarely spoke unless spoken to. Most athletes barely noticed her presence, yet Denise carried herself with unusual confidence. Her posture remained straight despite long hours of labor, and there was a calm steadiness in her eyes that hinted at experiences few people knew about. She quietly focused on her work while athletes moved around her. Jason noticed her while walking toward the locker room. As Denise carefully mopped a section near the center mat, a small amount of water splashed near Jason's expensive training shoes. He immediately stopped. "Seriously?" he said loudly. The room grew quieter. Denise looked up calmly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to splash your shoes." Jason glanced down dramatically. "Do you have any idea how much these cost?" A few athletes chuckled. Denise simply lowered her eyes and returned to her work. Most people would have let the matter go. Jason didn't. He stepped closer. "You should probably stay off the mats," he said. "This is where athletes train." More laughter followed. Several younger wrestlers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Coach Reynolds frowned. "That's enough, Jason." But Jason ignored him. The attention felt too good. The cameras, the sponsorships, the constant praise had convinced him that everyone around him existed somewhere beneath him. Denise continued mopping. Jason circled around her. "You know what's funny?" he said loudly. "People spend their whole lives working in places like this and never accomplish anything." The laughter grew louder. Denise paused for the first time. She slowly raised her head. The room became strangely quiet. Her expression remained calm. There was no anger, no embarrassment, just patience. Coach Reynolds noticed it immediately. For a brief moment, something about Denise's eyes seemed completely out of place for a maintenance worker. Jason failed to notice. He continued smiling. "What?" he asked. Denise returned to her work. "Nothing." The answer somehow irritated him even more. Several athletes were now openly recording with their phones. Jason spread his arms dramatically. "Come on, everyone. Let's see if she even knows what wrestling looks like." The crowd laughed again. Denise continued moving the mop. Coach Reynolds stepped forward. "Jason," there was a warning in his voice. Jason ignored it. He pointed toward the center mat. "You probably don't even know a single wrestling move." The room waited. For a moment, only the sound of the ventilation system could be heard. Denise stopped mopping. Slowly, she rested both hands on the handle. Then she looked directly at Jason. The confidence in her eyes instantly silenced several people nearby. Even Coach Reynolds appeared surprised. Denise spoke softly. "Are you sure you want to test that theory?" The words were calm, respectful, yet something about them immediately changed the atmosphere. A few athletes exchanged confused glances. Jason stared for a second before bursting into laughter. The entire room joined him. A maintenance worker challenging America's top young wrestler? It sounded ridiculous. Jason pointed toward the center mat. Everybody hear that? More laughter followed. He shook his head. This is going to be good. Denise simply stood there, completely unbothered by the attention surrounding her. For the first time all morning, Coach Reynolds looked concerned. Not for Denise, for Jason. Because something told him the young champion had just made a mistake he didn't yet understand. And while the crowd continued laughing, Jason took a step toward the mat and pointed directly at Denise. Then prove it. The room erupted with excitement as dozens of phones were raised into the air. Everyone believed they were about to witness a joke. No one realized they were about to witness the beginning of a scandal that would shake American wrestling. A cold wind swept through Colorado Springs the following afternoon, carrying dark clouds across the mountain skyline. Inside the National Wrestling Training Center, however, the atmosphere was far more electric than the weather outside. News of Jason Miller's challenge had spread through the building faster than anyone expected. By lunchtime, athletes, coaches, trainers, and support staff had gathered around the center mat. Phones were already recording. Some people were smiling in anticipation, expecting nothing more than an embarrassing joke at the expense of the quiet janitor. Jason stood at the center of the mat with the confidence of a man who had never truly been humbled. His broad shoulders were relaxed. His expression carried the same smug smile he had worn all morning. Several younger wrestlers surrounded him, eager to witness another moment of entertainment. Across the room, Denise Carter quietly placed her mop and bucket against the wall. She moved without hurry, without nervousness, without any sign that she felt intimidated. Coach Mark Reynolds watched her carefully. The longer he observed her, the more something felt unusual. Most people facing America's top young wrestler would have appeared frightened. Denise looked almost bored. Jason laughed as she approached. You actually came. Denise stopped a few feet away. You asked me to. Laughter spread through the crowd. Jason turned toward the spectators. Everyone get your cameras ready. More phones rose into the air. A young assistant coach named Tyler Grant stepped closer to the mat. Tyler was a 32-year-old former collegiate wrestler with sandy brown hair, a lean athletic frame, and a friendly personality that made him popular among younger athletes. Unlike Jason, Tyler respected everyone in the facility regardless of position. Even he looked uncomfortable watching what was happening. Maybe we should stop this, Tyler said quietly. Jason ignored him. The crowd was too invested now. 1 minute, Jason announced loudly. I'll go easy on you. Denise simply nodded. Coach Reynolds stepped forward. If we're doing this, nobody gets hurt. Jason grinned. Trust me, Coach, she'll be fine. For a brief moment, several people noticed Denise almost smile. The whistle sounded. Jason immediately moved forward. The crowd expected Denise to retreat. Instead, she stood perfectly still. Jason reached for her shoulders. What happened next unfolded so quickly that many people later insisted they hadn't seen it clearly. Denise shifted one foot, turned her hips, redirected his momentum, and suddenly Jason was airborne. A collective gasp exploded through the room. The young champion crashed flat onto the mat. Silence, absolute silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. Jason stared upward in disbelief. The phones continued recording. Some athletes exchanged stunned looks. Others wondered whether Jason had slipped. The champion quickly scrambled back to his feet, his face turning red. A nervous laugh escaped him. Okay. He adjusted his stance. That was lucky. Denise said nothing. The silence somehow made the situation worse. Jason charged again. This time harder, faster, more aggressively. Again Denise moved. Again his momentum worked against him. Again he hit the mat. Hard the crowd erupted. Not with laughter, with shock. Several athletes looked toward Coach Reynolds. The veteran coach no longer appeared surprised. He appeared concerned. Jason's confidence was beginning to crack. The young champion stood again. His breathing had changed. His smile was gone. Now anger had replaced it. For years, Jason had dominated nearly every opponent placed in front of him. Nobody embarrassed him, especially not a janitor. With a frustrated yell, he launched himself forward a third time. The result was even worse. Denise smoothly sidestepped him, controlled his arm, and sent him crashing onto the mat once more. This time nobody laughed, nobody spoke. The only sound came from dozens of phones capturing every second. Jason remained on the ground, humiliated, confused, unable to understand what had just happened. Denise stepped back. She offered him a hand. Jason refused to take it. Coach Reynolds finally walked onto the mat. That's enough. His voice ended the spectacle instantly. Jason slowly rose to his feet. For the first time since arriving at the training center, he looked completely lost. Meanwhile, whispers spread throughout the room. Who was this woman? How had she just outperformed America's top young wrestler? Why did she move like someone who had spent decades on a wrestling mat? The answers began arriving sooner than anyone expected. That evening, clips from the confrontation flooded social media. Millions of viewers watched the same shocking sequence. The country's rising wrestling star repeatedly thrown to the mat by a maintenance worker. By midnight, sports reporters had begun investigating. By the following morning, wrestling's forums were filled with speculation. Then the first major revelation appeared. An older sports journalist named Rachel Simmons published an article that changed everything. Rachel was a respected 61-year-old reporter known throughout American wrestling. With short auburn hair, sharp eyes behind thin glasses, and a reputation for uncovering forgotten stories, she had spent decades documenting the sport's history. Her article contained a single photograph, a much younger Denise Carter standing on a championship podium. The headline spread across social media within minutes. Former wrestling legend identified after viral training center incident. The reaction was immediate. People began digging through archives. Old photographs surfaced. National championship records emerged. Interviews from decades earlier reappeared online. Athletes across the country stared at their screens in disbelief. Denise Carter had not simply been a wrestler. She had been one of the greatest female wrestlers in American history, a multiple-time national champion, a respected international competitor, and perhaps most shocking of all, several Olympic medalists credited Denise as the coach who had helped shape their careers. The story grew larger every hour. Television networks picked it up. Sports podcasts discussed it. Former champions began sharing personal stories about her influence. Inside the training center, athletes gathered around their phones reading article after article. Coach Reynolds wasn't surprised. Certain pieces finally made sense. The posture, the movement, the confidence, the discipline. Meanwhile, Jason sat alone in a locker room staring at a screen. Each new headline felt like another punch. Every article revealed another accomplishment. Every interview exposed another layer of Denise's remarkable career. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had treated like a joke, the woman he had humiliated in front of everyone, was not an ordinary janitor. She was a living legend. And for the first time since becoming a wrestling star, Jason Miller realized that the person he had looked down upon stood far taller than he ever had. Heavy clouds hung low over Colorado Springs 3 days later, covering the mountains in a blanket of gray. A cold rain swept across the city after sunset, and by nightfall the National Wrestling Training Center stood nearly empty beneath the glow of parking lot lights. For Jason Miller, the nightmare had only begun. The viral video had spread far beyond the wrestling world. Sports networks replayed the footage hourly. Commentators criticized his behavior. Former athletes condemned the way he had treated Denise Carter. Every time Jason opened his phone, he found another headline, another interview, another reminder of the humiliating defeat that millions of people had witnessed. The sponsors who once celebrated him had become strangely quiet. One company removed his image from a promotional campaign. Another postponed contract negotiations. His follower count continued growing, but not for the reasons he wanted. People were no longer discussing his victories. They were discussing Denise. Jason sat alone in his apartment staring at his phone screen. His normally sharp appearance had begun to change. Dark circles formed beneath his blue eyes from several sleepless nights. His confidence had turned into bitterness. Instead of accepting responsibility, he convinced himself that Denise had ruined everything. If she had stayed out of it, he muttered. The thought became an obsession. The more praise Denise received, the angrier he became. The following morning, another announcement made matters worse. The National Wrestling Training Center revealed plans for a new athlete development program designed to mentor young wrestlers across the country. Denise Carter had accepted an advisory role and would help oversee portions of the training curriculum. The announcement generated immediate excitement. Jason saw only betrayal. Everyone was celebrating her. Everyone had forgotten him. That evening, he received a call from Brandon Pierce. Brandon was 26 years old, a former training partner with a muscular frame, shaved head, and thick beard that gave him an intimidating appearance. Though talented, Brandon had never reached Jason's level and often carried resentment toward successful athletes. He enjoyed gossip, controversy, and conflict far more than competition itself. "You see the news?" Brandon asked. Jason's jaw tightened. "Everybody's acting like she's some kind of saint." Brandon laughed. "People forget fast, give it time." But Jason wasn't interested in patience. His anger had reached a point where reason no longer mattered. Over the next several days, Denise's reputation continued growing. Television interviews appeared. Former champions publicly thanked her for helping their careers. Meanwhile, Jason found himself increasingly isolated. Coach Reynolds had stopped calling. Several teammates avoided him. Even Tyler Grant no longer attempted friendly conversations. For the first time in years, Jason felt completely alone, and loneliness mixed with pride can become dangerous. Late Friday night, rain hammered against the windows of the training center. Most employees had already gone home. Only a few security lights illuminated portions of the enormous building. Jason parked several blocks away. A hood covered his blonde hair. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the side entrance. Part of him knew what he was doing was wrong. Another part no longer cared. The athlete development program relied on new video equipment and digital training systems recently installed inside the facility. If those systems were damaged, the launch would be delayed. Denise's first major project could suffer a public setback. That was all Jason wanted. A setback, a reminder that she wasn't untouchable. After discovering an employee access code months earlier, Jason slipped inside the building. The empty facility felt completely different at night. The familiar sounds of training were gone. Only the hum of ventilation systems echoed through dark hallways. He moved quickly through the shadows until he reached the main arena. Rows of wrestling mats stretched across the floor below. Above them sat a technical catwalk used for lighting, cameras, and audio equipment. The new training system was connected to equipment mounted near the ceiling. Jason stared upward. His heart pounded. A single damaged connection could create weeks of delay. He climbed a maintenance ladder leading toward the catwalk. Rain tapped softly against the high windows. The building remained silent. At the top, Jason carefully moved across the narrow metal walkway. Far below, the wrestling mats looked much smaller than he remembered. He reached the equipment station and pulled a small tool from his pocket. For a moment he hesitated. The image of Denise briefly entered his mind, her calm face, the hand she had offered after throwing him, the interviews where she never once insulted him despite everything he had done. Jason pushed the thoughts away. He began working on the equipment. Then it happened. A sudden metallic snap echoed through the darkness. Jason froze. One section of the catwalk railing shifted unexpectedly beneath his weight. His eyes widened. The old support bracket had loosened. Instinctively, he grabbed for stability. His hand missed. The metal floor became slick beneath his shoes. Everything happened in seconds. Jason lost his balance. The tool flew from his hand. His body slammed against the railing. Then the railing gave way. A terrified scream echoed through the empty arena. Jason plunged downward. The fall felt endless. He crashed through part of the lighting structure before striking the floor below. Pain exploded through his body. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. For several moments he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe properly. When his vision finally cleared, he realized something far worse. A section of collapsed equipment had fallen with him. Heavy metal framework pinned one of his legs beneath twisted supports. Jason tried pulling free. Agony shot through his body. He screamed. No answer came. The building was empty. Rain continued striking the windows. The lights above flickered softly. Jason reached for his phone. It wasn't there. Somewhere during the fall it had disappeared. Panic surged through him. He pulled again. The metal refused to move. His breathing became rapid. The pain intensified. For the first time since childhood, Jason felt truly helpless. No teammates, no fans, no cameras, no sponsors. Only darkness, only pain, only the consequences of a decision nobody had forced him to make. As thunder rolled across the Colorado sky outside, Jason lay trapped beneath twisted equipment in the center of the empty arena. And for the first time in many years, fear completely replaced pride. Cold rain continued falling over Colorado Springs that night, washing across empty streets and rattling against the towering windows of the National Wrestling Training Center. Most of the city slept beneath the storm, unaware that a young wrestling star was fighting a very different battle inside the darkened arena. Jason Miller had lost all sense of time. Pain surged through his trapped leg every time he moved. His breathing had become uneven, and blood from a cut above his eyebrow slowly dried across one side of his face. The once confident champion who had stood before cameras and reporters now lay helpless beneath twisted steel and broken equipment. For hours he had shouted for help. Now he barely had the strength. The arena remained silent except for distant thunder. At one point he closed his eyes, wondering if anyone would find him before morning. Meanwhile, Denise Carter was driving home through the rain after spending the evening reviewing materials for the new athlete development program. Even after being thrust back into the national spotlight, Denise remained unchanged. She still preferred quiet evenings over interviews, and still cared more about helping young wrestlers than talking about her own accomplishments. Halfway home, she suddenly realized she had left an important folder inside her office at the training center. Normally she would have returned the next day, but the folder contained notes she needed for an early morning meeting. With a sigh, she turned her car around and headed back. The parking lot was almost completely empty when she arrived. Rainwater shimmered beneath the security lights. As Denise entered the building, something immediately felt unusual. The facility should have been completely quiet. Instead, she thought she heard a faint sound. She stopped walking. For several seconds, she listened. Nothing. Then it came again. A weak groan. Human. Denise instantly changed direction and followed the sound toward the main arena. The closer she got, the more concerned she became. When she stepped inside, her eyes widened. A section of equipment had collapsed near the center of the arena floor. Beneath it lay Jason Miller. For a brief moment, Denise simply stared. The sight was shocking. The young man who had mocked her, humiliated her, turned her into a public joke, now looked terrified. Jason slowly opened his eyes. At first he thought he was imagining things, then he recognized her. The shame that crossed his face was immediate. "Denise." His voice was barely a whisper. Without hesitation, Denise hurried to his side. Years spent coaching wrestlers had taught her how to remain calm during injuries. She quickly assessed the situation. The metal framework had pinned Jason's leg. Trying to free him alone could make the injury worse. "We need paramedics," she said firmly. Jason looked away. Of all the people who could have found him, it had to be her. The one person he least deserved help from. Denise immediately called emergency services and reported the accident. After giving the operator the necessary information, she remained beside him. The storm continued outside. Inside the arena, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Jason finally spoke. "You should have just left." Denise looked at him. "No, I don't deserve this." For several seconds she said nothing. Then she calmly replied, "This isn't about what you deserve." Jason stared at the ceiling. The words hit harder than any wrestling move ever had. Every mistake replayed in his mind. Every insult, every cruel joke, every decision that had brought him here. Yet the person sitting beside him showed no anger, no satisfaction, no revenge, only concern. Several minutes later, headlights appeared outside the building. The first emergency vehicle arrived. Leading the response team was Karen Mitchell, a 46-year-old paramedic supervisor with short auburn hair, sharp gray eyes, and a calm demeanor developed through 2 decades of emergency rescue work. Colleagues trusted her because she never panicked, even in the worst situations. Karen and her team immediately entered the arena carrying medical equipment. After a quick assessment, they carefully stabilized Jason's condition. Additional firefighters arrived moments later to assist with the heavy metal framework. Jason cried out as they slowly lifted the collapsed structure. The pain was intense, but at last his trapped leg was free. The medical team immediately began treatment. Throughout the entire process, Denise remained nearby, not because anyone asked her to, because she wanted to make sure he survived. As paramedics prepared Jason for transport, Karen nodded toward Denise. "You found him?" Denise nodded. Karen glanced at Jason. He was lucky. Jason knew she was right. Luck had brought Denise back to the building. Without her, nobody might have found him until morning. The realization was difficult to ignore. Moments later, Jason was secured onto a stretcher. Rain blew through the open entrance as emergency personnel wheeled him toward the ambulance. The flashing lights reflected across the wet pavement. Just before the stretcher entered the vehicle, Jason turned his head. His eyes found Denise standing beneath the arena entrance. For several seconds, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. No excuse would sound meaningful. No apology would feel sufficient. The weight of his actions had become impossible to escape. As the ambulance doors closed, Jason continued staring through the small rear window. Denise remained standing in the rain. The woman he had ridiculed. The woman he had blamed for his downfall. The woman he had tried to hurt. And now the woman who had saved his life. As the ambulance pulled away into the stormy Colorado night, Jason felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. Not anger, not pride, not resentment, only disbelief. Because the person who had every reason to abandon him had chosen instead to help him. The storm had finally passed over Colorado Springs. Bright morning sunlight reflected off the snow-capped Rocky Mountains, and for the first time in days, the city seemed calm. Inside the National Wrestling Training Center, however, the consequences of one terrible decision were only beginning. Jason Miller woke in a hospital room with his leg wrapped in heavy bandages. The physical pain was manageable. The emotional damage was not. Over the previous 48 hours, investigators had reviewed security footage from every corner of the training center. What they discovered left little room for interpretation. The cameras showed Jason entering the building after hours. They showed him accessing restricted maintenance areas. Most importantly, they showed him climbing toward the technical platform above the arena shortly before the accident. His intentions became impossible to deny. The story quickly reached the media. The same sports networks that had once celebrated his victories now reported on the failed act of sabotage. Social media exploded once again. This time there was no debate. The evidence spoke for itself. Several major sponsors immediately terminated their contracts. A national sportswear company released a statement distancing itself from Jason's actions. Another sponsor canceled an advertising campaign scheduled for later that year. The endorsements that had taken years to build disappeared within days. The National Wrestling Federation launched a formal investigation. Within a week, Jason was officially suspended from competition pending disciplinary review. The announcement dominated headlines. Many people assumed Jason would respond with anger. Instead, something unexpected happened. He stopped talking, stopped posting online, stopped defending himself. For the first time in years, silence entered his life. Meanwhile, Denise Carter experienced an entirely different reality. Messages arrived from former athletes across the country. National champions thanked her publicly. Olympic medalists shared stories about her mentorship. Television programs requested interviews. Journalists wanted profiles. But Denise remained the same person she had always been. She politely declined most media appearances and continued focusing on young athletes. One afternoon, the training center hosted a special gathering honoring her contributions to American wrestling. Hundreds attended. Athletes, coaches, journalists, and former champions filled the auditorium. Among them was Angela Morrison. Angela was a 54-year-old former Olympic wrestler with short black hair, strong features, and the confident posture of someone who had spent decades overcoming challenges. Years earlier, Denise had helped her recover after a career-threatening injury. Since then, Angela had become one of the sport's most respected advocates for athlete development. Standing before the audience, Angela summarized what many people felt. "Champions teach techniques," she said. "Legends teach character." The room erupted into applause. Several people rose to their feet. Denise looked uncomfortable with the attention. That humility only made people respect her more. A month later, the board of the National Wrestling Training Center announced another major decision. Coach Mark Reynolds would retire at the end of the season. After careful consideration, the board unanimously selected Denise Carter as the new head coach of the National Wrestling Training Center. The announcement generated overwhelming support. Athletes celebrated. Former students congratulated her. For many people, the decision felt long overdue. The woman who had quietly spent years cleaning the facility would now lead its future. Yet while Denise's career entered a new chapter, Jason struggled through one of the darkest periods of his life. His suspension remained active. His reputation had collapsed. Former friends rarely called. Many people who once praised him now avoided him completely. During long nights alone, he found himself thinking less about the accident and more about Denise. Not because of the wrestling match, not because of the scandal, because she had saved him. Again and again, he replayed that moment in his mind. She could have walked away. She didn't. The realization haunted him. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after the accident, Jason finally made a decision. He drove to the training center. The building looked exactly the same, but he felt completely different. His confidence had vanished. His arrogance had disappeared. When he entered the facility, several people immediately recognized him. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed him. Jason ignored them. He walked toward the main arena. Inside, Denise was overseeing a youth training session. Young wrestlers listened carefully as she demonstrated techniques on the mat. The moment she noticed Jason, she dismissed the class for a short break. Silence settled over the arena. Jason stood several feet away. For the first time in his life, he struggled to find words. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry." The words came out quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no audience. Just honesty. Denise waited. Jason lowered his eyes. "I blamed you for everything." His voice trembled slightly. "I humiliated you." He swallowed hard. "I tried to destroy something you cared about." The silence stretched. Then he looked directly at her. "And you still saved my life." For a moment, neither spoke. The arena remained completely still. Finally, Denise nodded. "Then learn from it." Jason frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Denise's expression remained calm. "The fall wasn't the worst thing that happened to you." Jason listened carefully. "The worst thing was becoming someone you didn't recognize anymore." The words struck deeper than any punishment. Because they were true. Jason stood quietly for several seconds. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "What do I do now?" Denise looked toward the young wrestlers waiting nearby. "Start over." The answer sounded simple, but both understood how difficult it would be. Jason nodded slowly. For the first time in months, a small sense of peace entered his mind. Not because his problems were solved, not because his career was restored, but because he had finally accepted responsibility. As he prepared to leave, he turned back toward Denise. "Thank you." She smiled. Not as a champion, not as a coach, not as a legend, simply as a decent human being. Months later, Denise officially took her place as head coach of the National Wrestling Training Center. Her first speech to the athletes was short. She spoke about discipline, about responsibility, about respect. And as she looked across the room, she reminded them of a lesson more valuable than any championship. True greatness is never measured by how many victories you collect. It is measured by the character you show when nobody is watching. For Jason Miller, that lesson had arrived at a terrible cost. But at last he understood it, because the greatest defeat of his life had not happened on a wrestling mat. It happened when he lost sight of the person he wanted to be, and the greatest victory was finding the courage to become that person again.